Welcome to the Psychology World podcast. I'm Connor Whiteley, bringing you psychology news, articles, and other interesting psychology-related articles. Where I can find the podcast notes and more interesting psychology-related things, and you can get your free 8 psychology book box set at connorwhiteley.net. Now let's get on to the show. Hello everyone, and welcome to episode 42 of the Psychology World podcast with me, Connor Whiteley. And today's episode is on how can psychology help policymakers during the COVID-19 pandemics. And I really enjoyed this episode. I think it's one of my best episodes for quite a while, so I really hope that you enjoy it. So moving on to the psychology news section. Psychology research in the coronavirus era, a high-stake version of Groundhog Day. As the reality, and it's the 11th of July 2020 as I record this, and of course I'm reading from the British Psychological Society Research Digest. So, back to the article. As the reality of the coronavirus pandemic set in March, we looked at the world of psychologists attempting to understand how the crisis is affecting us and how to inform our response to it. And this is also in part what today's episode is about. A few months later, and hundreds of studies have been conducted or are in progress examining everything from the spread of conspiracy theories to the characteristics that make people more likely to obey lockdown measures. However, some researchers have raised alarms. They worry that many of these rapid news studies have fallen prey to methodological issues, which could lead to false results and misleading advice. Of course, these aren't new problems. The pandemic comes at the end of a decade in which the field's methodological crisis has been thrust under the spotlight. But is the coronavirus pandemic causing research to fall back on bad habits, or could it lead to positive change for the field? So I definitely understand this, and I've seen some of these studies, and I don't know if some of them are interesting, all I'm going to say. So I really hope that the method and the different bits, I hope that psychology researchers do care and think about the method, because I think even if you look at some of the, not necessarily classic studies, but if you look at some of the normal studies that we all like, sometimes the methods does seem a bit interesting, because some of them it does seem like you do a method, you get results, and you just try and link it to what you're looking for. That's always interesting. So I think that the takeaway here is that when we're all doing research, of course, if you're a student or a researcher, I think we just need to be mindful about what method I'll be using. And this is why personally in my methods, I really like doing method triangulation. So this is when you use more than one method, because if you get similar results using more than one method, then this increases the credibility of your results. So when I do research in the future, that's definitely something that I'm going to be mindful of, and something that I'd definitely be trying to do. And this is something I'm quite interested in, because as a human branding person, this also links into artificial intelligence, and this is something that I'm interested in. So what makes a good robot teacher? I know I'm a bit robot teacher, no thank you, but I'm sure that's what everyone has said about phones and TVs, so you never know. For young children, the biggest source of knowledge about the world is other people. Unsurprisingly then, we all have kinds of strategies for deciding whom to trust, only learning from confident others if their confidence has proven to be justified, for example, and showing more trust in claims made by nice people. However, our world is increasingly filled with technological devices designed to impart knowledge, and educational robots are being used to teach children language, maths and science. And the authors of a new paper write, the rapid expansion of robot instructors, in quotation marks, makes it increasingly important to investigate whether and when robots effectively transmit information to children. The team finds that to learn well from a robot, a child may need to believe that it has some human-like attributes. Without these, even a device that reliably gives information is not trusted. And this is quite interesting, because I'm actually going to explain it through human branding terms. So, as humans, we need to connect to people, and humans connect to humans. So, if we want any chance to connect to a robot, and for us to know, like, and trust them, then they need to be human to some extent. Of course, they need to be a lot more human if we want a proper connection, but human-like attributes are what you need if you want any sort of connection between the student and the teacher, which lots of studies do show that you just need. And I think we all know that from our schooling days, we need to have connections with people. So because this is such a big episode, the content part. We're just going to do one more. Why not this one? So, encouraging self-compassion may help people with chronic pain lead to more active, happier lives. While we're on the theme of self-compassion, it's worth checking out some of the past posts on the emotional benefits it can bring, such as this from 2018. In chronic pain, the pain system is locked into high alert mode. One of my colleagues described it as placing your alarm system after a burglary, but with one so sensitive it goes off when a fly goes through the room. Mere touch might now be experienced as pain. The pain is real. It isn't just in the head, but nor is there a hidden jewelry to fix the illness that can be cured. It's a system that needs retuning, and that calls for participation from the body itself. According to a paper in the Journal of Clinical Psychology, one particular promising way that psychologists can help is by encouraging self-compassion and practice by recognizing one's suffering. Expect this as part of the shared human experience and not over-identifying with the suffering. This, I think, is quite interesting. So if any of you are feeling from a chronic pain, then, I don't know, just try and practice self-compassion. So accept that you're suffering, appreciate yourself, and just accept this is part of the shared human experience. Yeah, so I think that's all I can say on this. So I hope you enjoyed the psychology news section. So let's move on to the personal update. Moving on to the personal update of today's episode. So in a minute I'm going to be talking about this psychology conference, and I'm actually really pleased with the episode because this is a proper podcast episode, so it should be quite nice and long, filled with great information for you. This will just be a reasonably quick episode. This will be a reasonably quick personal update. So this week I've just been focusing on fiction. I'm getting ready for some fiction books I wrote last year, ready for release in a few weeks. But onto the psychology stuff. I was fuming on Monday because I was doing some stuff on my emails on my Hotmail account, so on Microsoft Outlook, and then I got an email from the editor of the Psychologist magazine, which I thought was, for the past few days I've been at that time I've been thinking it was a bit odd that I submitted that article to the British Psychological Society and they've not got back to me, even if it was just to reject it. I did expect something, and then the email said, well, I'm sorry, but you've missed the boat on this. So I thought, that's weird. Then I looked at the email when I apparently sent it. So my email told me that I'd sent it on the 17th of April, but when I looked at the response, it turns out that, well, the email got sent on the 6th of July, so I was not impressed because it turns out my article never actually got submitted. Well, I sent the email just didn't get delivered, so I'm not that happy with Microsoft Outlook, but it just shows, I don't know what it shows, to be honest. So like, if a mistake ever happens to you, it happens to all of us, and it just shows don't use unreliable email stuff or just unreliable stuff in general. And then there's 3 other bits of psychology bits. So I finished recording the cognitive psychology book for the audiobook of the 2nd edition, so I'm hoping to release on the wide platforms like Kobo, Apple Books, Google Play and all that by the end of next week, so you've got that to look forward to. Yeah, so that would probably be the highlighted product on next week's episode. That I really enjoyed that audiobook, and I actually forgot how the information was explained really easily, and my narration's definitely a lot more performance based, so it haven't got this boring droning on person who just reads out the information. Not that I ever was like that, but I really have highlighted, and it's just the tone of my voice. I don't know where I'm going with this, but you should enjoy it more. So I'll talk about that next week. But I've been reading this brilliant book as part of a research for another psychology book that I plan to write, and it's all about formulation. And if you're at all familiar with clinical psychology, it's basically when you try and make up a hypothesis, but you don't make it up. You use evidence and information gathered from the client, and you try and make a hypothesis for their suffering and their condition. So this I'm really quite looking forward to because it's something that you learn in your masters, in your clinical psychology masters and doctorate. So I'm reading this great book. I'll get it for you. So I've been making notes all week. I started reading this on Monday, but it's Formulation in Psychology and Psychotherapy, 2nd edition. Making Sense of People's Problems, edited by Lucy Johnson and Ruby Dallas. And it's actually a really good book. I'm actually quite enjoying it. And considering it's a pleasure read, I'm quite pleased with myself that I'm enjoying it. And in fact, I'm just chipping away at it. Like the stuff about systemic therapy was actually quite interesting. But again, I talk about all of this for my clinical psychology book, which is coming up in the next month. I'll start working on it next week, and then I'll give it to my editor. Yes, and then it should be released sometime in August and September. And it should be really interesting when I've done that, when I've released it, and hopefully all of you should enjoy it. Enjoy it because formulation is a massive topic, and as it's a topic that you tend to do in your masters, I think it can be a bit complicated. But as always, I aim to explain stuff in an easy to understand way that all of you can enjoy. And then I've already mentioned that I plan to get 2 books ready for release hopefully for you all. Yes, so that's it for the update. And as always, I just wanted to remind you that you can always contact me if you can always tweet me on Twitter at sci-fi whiteley, and you can always email me at connorwhiteley@connorwhiteley.net. And today's episode, because it's to do with social psychology and influencing people. So this sponsor does actually work quite well with the theme of today's episode. Yes, the highlight of today's episode is my social cultural psychology book, 2nd edition, and this is the blurb. So, do you want to learn why groups behave like they do? Do you want to learn how our groups influence us? Do you want to learn how our coach impacts our behaviour? If the answer to any of those questions and more is yes, then this is the book for you. As together we explore social psychology and how groups impact our behaviour in an engaging and easy to understand way. By the end of this book, you will have a great understanding of how groups, culture, and ourselves can impact our behaviour. If you like this book, then you will love my human relationship book as well. And then the book talks about tons of different stuff. For example, how globalization is impacting us, cultural dimensions, persuasion, which is a massive thing in today's episode, how aggression affects us, social group, intergroup relations. This group goes into so much, but it's all explained in a nice, easy to understand way. So I hope you enjoyed this book, and it's available on Amazon, Kobo, Google Play, and all major ebook retailers, including Barnes & Noble. If you want to support the show personally for just a couple of dollars a month, and if you want to get tons of bonuses, or exclusive bonuses that only Patreon supporters can get, then please go to patreon.com/Connor Whiteley, patreon.com/Connor Whiteley. So let's move on to the content part of today's episode. Moving on to the content part of today's episode, we're going to be talking about the highlights from the British Psychological Society conference in 2020, and the theme of the conference was on changes in psychology. So as I briefly mentioned last week, it was quite a good conference. It's not quite what I was expecting, but there were quite a few lots of really interesting talks. So for starters, there were these 2 really great quotes. For example, the first one was, "No one is safe until everyone is safe." And I truly believe that this quote is brilliant because it truly highlights the severity of the pandemic, because it really does show that even if 1 or 2 people are still infected and therefore unsafe, then the virus can easily spread and infect hundreds, if not thousands, of people all over again. And this is, of course, way before we think about it spreading to other countries and these 2 or 3 people going on holiday infecting the local population, and then it gets all out of hand yet again. Quite also shows that it's vital how, as a society, we do need to thrive to make sure that everyone is safe from the virus, as well as it highlights, as a species, we need to make sure that every person, regardless of sex, race, gender, sexuality, country of origin, is safe from the COVID-19 virus. And then the other really, really good quote is that if there's no vaccine or cure, then disease control has to be behavioural. And this is such a good quote, I think, because it really shows the power of psychology, because it really does prove that only through modifying people's behaviour will we be able to control and live with the virus. For example, we will need to wash our hands more regularly, socially distance, and perform other behaviours. And the only way to do this for the long term is to modify behaviour. And this is where psychology comes in. This is why I love it, because tons of people think that psychology does not have a place because it's not a real science. Of course, everyone in psychology pretty much calls them idiots. Psychology definitely has a place, and it is a science. It might not be a hard science, like we cannot definitively prove X and Y, but we can still make very, very good scientific discoveries. And the main part of today's episode, the episode that I want to talk to you about, is how can psychology help policymakers during the pandemic? Because out of all the talks during the BPS conference, this was my absolute favourite, because this really resonated with me, because this definitively shows that psychology does have a real world impact. So this is what we're going to go through. And during this particular talk, there were 9 suggestions that the British Psychological Society put forward to the UK government about the governmental policies and how to influence behaviour during the pandemic. However, we're only going to focus on 8 because there was this one that was worded so weirdly. I'm thinking, no, I'm going to have tons of useful information for you, and I don't want to overload or overwhelm any of you. So the first one was minimise the I, emphasise the we. With the Western societies being individualistic approaches that focus on the needs of the individual compared to the group, it is somewhat natural for people to do things for the needs and betterment of the group and sacrifice things for themselves. As, let's face it, social distancing is very detrimental to the individual and not going to work. And I think we all know that, because tons of people are losing money because of this. Nonetheless, during a pandemic, we need to think like collectivist coaches and to focus on the needs of the group to keep everyone safe and to prevent the spread of the virus. This is why the idea of the we is very, very important, as this gets people to realise that they are protecting everyone else by sacrificing things that would benefit them personally. For example, to keep people safe, we need to focus on the needs of society and not ourselves. Note, this links to cultural dimensions as discussed in Social Cultural Psychology 2nd edition. So this one I really like because it is about modifying the way we think. And to be honest, we also need to consider that if we don't think about the we, then we will be affected for the long term. Because if tons of people die, let's say that 1% did die, so the UK has a population of around 67 million. Granted, I've not checked it in a while. So let's say that 670,000 people that die, God, that's a lot of people, then that is majorly detrimental to the individual, because chances are a family member or someone you know will die. So that will have catastrophic mental health problems, and that could be really detrimental to you in the long term. So it's sort of like you make a sacrifice now for the short term for the betterment of the long term. And then the second one is messages from credible sources. And I did go slightly political in this point, but I only did it to support my points. So in social psychology and persuasion, it's a well-known fact that the message needs to come from a credible source, so people are more likely to listen and be influenced by it. Therefore, to influence people's behaviour and get them to follow government guidelines and to stop the spread of COVID-19, then the messages need to be delivered from a credible source. This is why when the Scottish Chief Medical Advisor became an unreliable source for the Scottish Government needed to change all their adverts to get rid of this now uncredible source. And by doing this, it allowed the Scottish Government to maintain their credibility, and people stayed persuaded by their messages. However, this gets a bit more political. On the other hand, when the UK government didn't sack Dominic Cummings, and I know this is a very international audience, but I'll just explain it for US and everyone else. What Dominic Cummings did is that, so the story goes that his wife had COVID-19 and we were on a proper lockdown, and you were not allowed to leave your house except for 4 reasons, which did not apply in this situation. So his wife apparently had COVID-19 and they had 2 small children. So then what happened is that he decided to drive over 250 miles north to his home somewhere in the north of England, and then they decided to live with his mum and dad or stay closer by them just so they could look after the children. And this is where the story gets really messy, or gets really quite confusing, because some government sources said he stayed with his family, so he mixed with another household and he didn't go to a more local base, and it's just turned really messy because basically he broke lockdown rules, he broke government guidance. So that was really annoying. A lot of the UK population lost faith in the government, so their credibility was lost. And I hate to say it, but a lot of British people, in my experience, are no longer persuaded by the government's messaging. And basically no one has faith in the government anymore, or very few people. Because there was a poll done, and during the pandemic, the number of people who supported the government was 72%, but now it's either 32% or 34%. So it's really dropped in the case of 3 months, and I definitely understand why. But again, not political. I just want to show you how messaging needs to be from a credible source. And you can learn more about persuasion in Social Cultural Psychology, 2nd edition. So create worry, not fear. Now, this is a difficult one, as during a pandemic, you need people to be concerned and act accordingly by changing their behaviour to help fight against the virus. However, persuasion psychology teaches us that you need to be careful, as if you create too little worry, then no one will care. Equally, if you create too much fear, then people will enter denial behaviour, and they won't follow the guidelines, or they will not be influenced by the messaging. This is why it's critical that the government uses enough information and data to create worry, but not so much that people are too frightened as well as fearful. Then the next one, clearly specify behaviours, their effectiveness, and be evidence-based. So I decided to merge these topics into one section because people need to be able to understand what they need to do, why they should do it, as well as what's the evidence for this so-called effectiveness. For example, to combat the community spread of the virus, people need to be clearly told what social distancing is, why social distancing is effective, and what evidence is there for its effectiveness. And it's all well and good a government telling people to socially distance, but why? Why socially distance when it's so detrimental to the self because of mental health reasons and other important things? Hence why it's important to stress the effectiveness of social distancing, as well as this feeds back to the idea of emphasising the we and not the I. Furthermore, a government's policies need to be evidence-led, and I'm not going to mention that the BPS thankfully confirmed that the UK government isn't following the science. The BPS works with the government directly, so they know what's happening. Because leaders need to use the evidence and science to make informed decisions about how to combat the virus. Nevertheless, the concept of being evidence-based applies to credibility as well, as you need to use evidence to see how people will behave. For example, I regretfully know that lots of people think that psychology and how people behave is common sense, yet those of us in psychology know that behaviour is far from common sense due to a number of factors, including the cognitive biases. Therefore, leaders need to use data, evidence, and expert advice to shape policy so that they follow the science and not political aspirations and motivations. And moving on to our penultimate one. Avoid unintended consequences, and as psychologists, I think we're all quite into this one, because this is another critical suggestion by the BPS to the UK government, because leaders need to be careful about their policies, even more so during a pandemic, as they need to avoid unintended consequences. For example, now the UK is starting to open up again, a lot of people feeling anxious and concerned, as well as other experts believe the government's policies could lead to an increase in social deprivation. And this is actually quite true, because a family member this week went into a supermarket, and this family member had been completely calm during the pandemic, but because the supermarket had got rid of social distancing, they got rid of all the stuff that made the supermarket safe, they had a panic attack, because this person has been quite anxious lately because everything's been opening up. So this is a direct unintended consequences of the government starting to open up. So this isn't the government's fault necessarily, it's just this is an unintended consequence that nobody saw coming. So I think over the next few months, I think this anxiety is actually going to become quite common. And also, I know that tons of people lately have been feeling a lot more anxious, because if you remember back at the beginning of the pandemic, we were quite anxious, we were really concerned about it, but now we're sort of okay with the new normal, but now all this fear has begun to come back. So consequently, leaders need to design their policies so that their aims are achieved without creating other problems that need to be solved further down the line. And the final one, pledge to work together. Very important for all politicians. Finally, leaders need to show people that they are working with them to solve this pandemic and fight back, because people are more likely to work with the government and follow guidelines if they feel valued and listened to. And this also goes back to my favourite thing, human fandom. So I hope that you've enjoyed this social psychology, cognitive psychology, and political psychology episode of the Psychology Word podcast. And if you want to learn more about persuasion and influence, which is heavily featured in today's episode, then please check out Social Cultural Psychology 2nd edition. So I hope you've enjoyed this, and have a great day, and I'll see you next time. Thanks for listening today. I hope you enjoyed it. If you want to see the show notes, then please go to connorwhiteley.net. And if you want a free 8-book psychology box set, then please go to connorwhiteley.net. Have a great day, and I'll see you next time.